Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the sci-fi horror hellscape of Phyrexia, and the potential and problems of adapting it into a licensed chapter for Dead by Daylight. Let me make something clear before this video really kicks off. Alongside horror media in general, Magic the Gathering is my other major autism-fueled hyperfixation. I understand the video's premise might seem odd or alienating, a card game that's decidedly not a horror game, making its way to Dead by Daylight, but all I'm going to say is, go with me on this adventure. It's not entirely self-indulgence, mind you. The Phyrexians and Elesh Norn actually beat Art the Clown recently in a Twitter poll for this month's Potential Problems video, so it's clear there is some demand for it. And if you're unsure where I'm going with this, then please do stick around if you're curious. The ride might be a little bumpy, but it'll be worth it for destination, I assure you. When you think of the words trading card game, Magic the Gathering is probably the first thing you're thinking of. Or at least it's up there with Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! You might know it by name, by knowing somebody who plays it, by having played it yourself as a kid, scraping a Black Lotus on Asphalt Playground, not knowing you could have paid off your mortgage with it if you'd have kept the damn thing until you were an adult. It's a game with a lot of history, 30 years of it, and not all of it has been great. Wizards of the Coast, the company behind Magic, that's owned by the toy giant Hasbro, have an even worse record on getting themselves into scandals than Behaviour does. The most recent one involving setting the fucking Pinkertons on a YouTuber who revealed leaked content. Imagine if Behaviour did that, sent hired anti-union thugs to Schmuckles and Mintskull, and confiscated their DBD accounts because they made videos on leaks. Wait, maybe Wizards are onto something. But throughout those 30 years, there have been some enduring constants. The 5 colours of mana that govern both the game systems and the world of Magic the Gathering, the myriad of fantastical planes inhabited by bizarre and deadly creatures, and the colourful cast of planeswalkers who travel between them. But we're not here to talk about those, at least not directly, because what interests me, and let's be honest, what's probably here interesting you, is a slightly different constant. One a bit more oily. Let me introduce you to Magic's oldest, most iconic, and most terrifying villains, the Phyrexians. Stories of Magic take place on various planes, different worlds with radical variations in climate, indigenous life, and levels of technology. You've got Ravnica, the endless city squabbled over by the 10 guilds at the backbone of its society, the steampunk paradise of Jade and Filigree on Kaladesh, and the fairy tale forests of Lorwyn and Eldraine, on top of many, many others. But there's been no name that has so consistently indicated that shit is about to get serious than Phyrexia. When Phyrexia comes to call, we see a cavalcade of monstrosities and horrors with a much darker tone than Magic will normally allow its family-friendly image to approach. And the appearance of its denizens in a story or early card previews is always enough to turn heads. Today I'm going to be talking about why Phyrexia as a setting is ripe for the picking as a Dead by Daylight chapter, the options that exist for a killer, and, as we always do, a power concept for the character I end up settling on. So let's say you know nothing about Magic or its setting, and you want to know, what the hell is Phyrexia's deal? To put it simply, Phyrexia is a world where machinery and biology are one and the same. Normal life forms with normal anatomy just don't exist here. The flora and fauna are twisted into mockeries of what they should be, and the inhabitants have been turned into monstrosities in the service of Phyrexia's dark goals. The great work is the ultimate goal of all Phyrexians, to see every being and every plane either brought into the fold of Phyrexia or annihilated completely. The process of turning a living being into a Phyrexian is called completion, and it's a mixture between a religious conversion, biological mutation, and very invasive surgery. And the process begins most often through exposure to Phyrexian oil. This oil contains the genetic legacy of Phyrexia, memories of its history, its methods and ideology, and its creator Yawgmoth. And once it enters your system, yeah, you're pretty much fucked. The effects of Phyrexian oil are exhibited in the story Uncontrolled Descent, readable on the Magic website, link in the description, as the planeswalker Nahiri falls victim to the oil.
Nahiri didn't feel right. She was familiar with her body and the way it was meant to come together. Bones and tissues laced like stones in good soil. And right now, something felt awry. The cut at the back of her neck, the small, inconsequential injury, throbbed, intruding on her awareness more than anything so minor had the right to. She hung back a little, allowing Melira to pass her, before she reached behind herself to feel the bandage she'd taken from Kaido's pack. The gauze was oddly bunched, as if something had pressed against it from below. Peeling back the bandage, she touched the surface beneath with delicate fingers and found no injury, only smooth skin and a short, slick protrusion that had no business growing there, as if her bones had decided to reshape themselves. She pulled her hand away with a hiss of dismay, somehow unsurprised to see that they gleamed with the same glistening oil as had tipped the spears of the Phyrexians. She was infected. She was already lost.
Before long, Nahiri had become just another weapon in Phyrexia's arsenal against the world of flesh, and the physical transformation she takes on is emblematic of that. The weapons she used to create and wield have been grafted to her body. Her blood is replaced with boiling oil, and her mind is twisted into the service of the being she sought to destroy. Dead by Daylight has never been a stranger to body horror, with the monstrous transformation of the Blight being the most obvious and blatant example. But the arrival of the Phyrexians into the setting would take it to a whole new level. The denizens of Phyrexia look just enough like ordinary creatures or people to be recognisable. That's a dragon, that's an ogre, that's a dog. But bear physiological augmentations that show that that's secondary now. Their role in life, their role to exist, is in service of Phyrexia, and their body and mind have been sculpted to that image of perfection. We only recently had our first sci-fi horror killer in the Singularity, but the Phyrexians have perfected the art of making part organic, part machine characters and creatures that truly, well, embody the term body horror. Well, kind of. So I'm talking about Phyrexia here, there's actually two different places that have had the name Phyrexia. To understand the difference between them, and to help us pick which one should be highlighted in a potential Dead by Daylight chapter, it's time to get knuckle deep in the absolute shitfest that is Magic's lore. Strap in, the safe word is mother, because this is going to get silly. The world originally known as Phyrexia was the creation of Yawgmoth, this Lucius Malfoy looking motherfucker, who was a physician living in the Thran Empire on the plane of Dominaria, exiled for 5 years after being on the wrong side of a civil war. Yawgmoth was recalled back to the Thran capital city of Halcyon because the Thran ruler Glacian was in need of his medical assistance. He contracted a disease Yawgmoth would call Phyresis, from the power stones that fueled the Thran Empire, a shard of which had been used to stab Glacian and infect him with the disease in the first place. Yawgmoth seized opportunity to take power in Halcyon. With the man who stabbed Glacian, a revolutionary called Gix, under his thumb as Yawgmoth's right-hand man in the underworld of Halcyon, Yawgmoth used the fear of Phyresis to corral the population and effectively command the entire city. But when various diplomats came forward from outside the Thran Empire, with stories of atrocities that Yawgmoth had committed to their people during his years in exile, Yawgmoth found himself in need of a backup plan. He contracted the planeswalker Dyfed to help him to construct a portal to a new world, somewhere he could retreat with his followers to build a paradise free from Dominaria's conflicts. When Yawgmoth arrived in this new world, he immediately ensconced himself as its god, the father of machines, in his new homeworld, Phyrexia. When the factions Yawgmoth had wronged rose up in an army and lay siege to Halcyon, the Thran people fled into the planar portal to Phyrexia to escape the onslaught, and Glacian's wife Rebecca would go on to seal the portal once Halcyon had fallen, trapping Yawgmoth and the Thran refugees in Phyrexia. Fast forward a few thousand years and two brothers, Urza and Mishra, found the power stones that Rebecca had used to seal the planar portal and inadvertently reopened it, allowing the now fully formed Phyrexians to access the plane for the first time in millennia. Yawgmoth sent Gix, now a completely transformed servant of Phyrexia, to prepare Dominaria for full-scale invasion, and he installed sleeper agents to instigate discord between Urza and Mishra that would escalate into a plane-wide conflict known as the Brothers' War. Gix went as far as completing Mishra before Urza's explosive ascension as a planeswalker saw Mishra destroyed and the sleeper agents routed. Urza would go on to prepare Dominaria against the Phyrexian invaders, rallying a group of planeswalkers known as the Nine Titans under his banner, and crafting new and terrible weapons of war to fight back against Yawgmoth. When Urza was taken to Phyrexia, he saw a world of steel and oil created in Yawgmoth's image, factories and clothing vats, billowing noxious smoke into blackened skies, and biomechanical horrors that could only have been dreamed of in the mind of a mad god, or at least a man who thought he was God. Nevertheless, it was enough to briefly tempt Urza to bend the knee to Yawgmoth, Dominaria's defender buckling to Phyrexia's will, and it took his realization and eventual sacrifice to see Yawgmoth finally destroyed when he arrived on Dominaria himself, for the first time in 9,000 years in the closing stages of the invasion. The Phyrexians that spearheaded the invasion of Dominaria can be found most prominently in, well, Invasion block, and it's clear through the art direction of the Phyrexian cards from that block that they were designed by Yawgmoth to be his shock troops in the invasion of Dominaria. Look at the art for a card like Devouring Strossus, for example. It's clearly designed after a classical fantasy creature like a demon or a gargoyle, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a fantasy setting like Magic. But the exposed wiring in the arms and thick metal carapace show it's more machine than living being at this point, and the gas mask evocative of World War I soldiers affirms to us that this creature has been prepared for a grim and bloody battle in hostile environments. Well, environments the Phyrexians have probably made hostile themselves. To bring a creature of Phyrexia from this period in time to Dead by Daylight would certainly be a challenge, but far from an insurmountable one. While the evocative artworks used in the late 90s and early 2000s to depict Phyrexians would be difficult to translate one-to-one to the game of Dead by Daylight, the recent set The Brothers' War that took modern Magic back to its historic roots showed us modern depictions of old-school Phyrexians. Dead by Daylight has restored old properties to its modern art style before. They did it with Silent Hill, bringing a killer from a game that came out the same year as Invasion block into the game, and resurrecting an old design with behaviour's typical artistic polish. And as for characters from Phyrexia's olden days to adapt in Dead by Daylight, there's a ton of them, as you'd expect from a faction that took 7 years to develop fully, from a few cards and antiquities to Magic's premier villains. Yawgmoth and Gix are the two central figures behind Phyrexia's presence in these stories, with Yawgmoth obviously being top dog. Sabo Tavok, Zancha and Karik, among many, many more, but Gix and Yawgmoth are inarguably the two central villains of the old days of Phyrexia. Despite being the big bad guy in the middle of it all, Yawgmoth would not be a good killer. His power has never been even close to physical, and he spent his life either as a mundane human man who was better at scheming, plotting and mad science shit than he ever was at killing on his own, or he was a literal physical god ensconced in Phyrexia's spheres who never left the plane, because he just had everybody doing everything for him. It'd be like having Satan as a killer. It's just kind of beyond this game's scale to have the devil himself, so you gotta work with something a bit more manageable. Gix would fit this role perfectly, as a physical force to be reckoned with who regularly got his hands dirty in the service of Yawgmoth. It helps that we do actually have an updated physical appearance for Gix, thanks to the Brothers' War giving him a new card, and Gix was incredibly powerful, capable of going toe-to-toe with planeswalkers like Urza during the height of Yawgmoth's invasion, but adapting him into Dead by Daylight comes with some problems despite the potential. Even in the Brothers' War, Gix wasn't exactly the main attraction that people were excited about. It was, surprise surprise, the Brothers' War. The part that got everybody interested was the battle between Urza and Mishra. Gix was just a background player, who orchestrated the fall of Mishra and came back whenever Yawgmoth's physical presence needed to be felt in a story. He was a dog's body, and not even the cool kind like Darth Vader who overshadowed his boss. He was pretty much a functionary, and like the rest of old Phyrexia, hasn't been a relevant part of Magic's story in more than 20 years. Apocalypse in 2001 marked the destruction of Yawgmoth and Gix and the desolation of old Phyrexia, and making a DVD chapter about content that's older than many of the game's players seems redundant. Gix or any other old school Phyrexian as a killer would appeal to a fairly niche market in a fairly niche card game. The kind of people who've either been played since the game came out 30 years ago, or are just giant lore whores like me who actually read these old stories. If you're interested in these old stories, by the way, and want to learn more about Yawgmoth and his philosophies as the power player he was in the Thrawn Empire, there's an amazing video linked in the description by Spice8Rack exploring the last days of the Thrawn Empire and Yawgmoth's Genesis ideology, so do go take a look. But Will, I hear you asking, you stayed in the video this long, and props for incredible endurance if you have, by the way. If Phyrexia is so old and irrelevant now, why are you even making this video? Well, I've referred a lot in this video so far to old Phyrexia, and that's not the only place in the Magic universe to go by the name of Phyrexia. So let's press on. Out with the old, and in with the new. While Phyrexia was left desolated by Urza and his legacy weapon, that didn't mean the Phyrexian threat was gone for good. Khan, a golem created by Urza and imbued with a planeswalker's powers, ended up creating his own plane after the war was over, the world of Mirrodin. Mirrodin's flora and fauna were imbued with living metal, and even the people who lived there had metallic growths extruding from their bodies when they were born. This made them easy prey for the oil that, turns people into fucking machines. And even Khan himself fell prey to it after he accidentally brought a trace of Phyrexian oil to Mirrodin, and it propagated into a plane-wide threat. As the defenders of Mirrodin were completed or killed, Khan's body and mind became sickened by the oil, until he was ensconced in the heart of Mirrodin as the new Father of Machines. Despite a valiant attempt at resistance by the Mirrodin defenders, Mirrodin crumpled under the Phyrexian war machine, and even though Khan was able to escape Mirrodin thanks to the sacrifice of his friend and fellow planeswalker Venza, the damage to the world could not be undone. Mirrodin had fallen, and in its place rose a name that would go on to terrorize the multiverse: New Phyrexia. These new Phyrexians who grew from Mirrodin's flesh and metal are very different from the originals who were directly created by Yawgmoth to serve as expressions and enforcers of his will. The old Phyrexians were typically constructed for a specific purpose, and that is reflected in their design. They look created, functional but ultimately with little pomp and circumstance. Anything that isn't necessary for their function is typically stripped down, because their resources could be allocated better somewhere else. New Phyrexians, on the other hand, look more corrupted than created. They still bear many of the hallmarks of the living beings that they used to be, because their flesh isn't really their own, just borrowed from Mirrodin's defenders. There's no single grand architect that decides how they look, and this leads to a more diverse and visually interesting array of Phyrexian life forms than you'd find in old Phyrexia. In my opinion, this also makes the new Phyrexians scarier, because a key part of effective body horror is recognising what the horrific thing should look like, so you can properly grasp the degree to which it's wrong. Old Phyrexia did this to a degree, but it's the bread and butter of new Phyrexia's visual design language. This change in visual language also reflects a change in ideology between the old and new Phyrexians. The old Phyrexians were really just an expression of Yawgmoth's will. They didn't really think or want, they just were, and only were according to Yawgmoth's value placed on their existence. Borrowing Yawgmoth's high command, they were effectively mindless drones. The new Phyrexians were often, but not always, different. They always had a bit more initiative and imagination than Yawgmoth's Phyrexians ever did, and more importantly, did want something. Unfortunately, what they did not have was the free will to want anything other than Phyrexian domination, because they were effectively brainwashed into seeing Phyrexian life as the only thing that means anything, the only life that matters. In this, the annihilation or conversion of all life that is not Phyrexian becomes religious doctrine. Instead of worshipping Yawgmoth as a god, they follow the ideology that he left behind as scripture and interpret it in their own ways. Due to the completion process of New Phyrexia being somewhat more organic than Yawgmoth's careful designs, completed New Phyrexians typically have a bit more individuality and personality, something that's exacerbated by the effect of Mirrodin's suns on the living things of New Phyrexia. Mirrodin was a plane with 5 suns, each composed of a different colour of mana, and these 5 suns influenced the Phyrexians who colonised Mirrodin and further increased the diversity that you saw among Phyrexian life forms. Old Phyrexians were almost entirely creatures of black mana, the colour of death, ambition and ego that reflects Yawgmoth's literal god complex, but the new Phyrexians can be found across all colours of mana. Each of the 5 colours has its own dedicated faction among the new Phyrexians, led by its respective praetor, who most thoroughly embodies that faction's ideals. The blue Progress Engine led by Jin Gitaxias, the red Quiet Furnace led by Urobrask, the green Vicious Swarm led by Vorinclex, the black 7 Steel Thanes led by Sheoldred, and the white Machine Orthodoxy led by Elesh Norn. If we're talking about iconic characters in the history of Phyrexia to immortalise in Dead by Daylight, this is where we should be looking. The Praetors are insanely popular, and have been since their debut in New Phyrexia in 2011. And the recent Magic story over the past couple of years has showcased each of the Praetors in turn, as New Phyrexia prepares for full-scale invasion of the multiverse. While each of the Praetors have their own agenda and identity, both visually and in terms of gameplay, there is one that rose above the others in Khan's absence to truly rule New Phyrexia, uniting the 5 factions under one banner as the new Mother of Machines. And I'll give you a clue, she's the one in the thumbnail. Elesh Norn, Grand Cenobite of the Machine Orthodoxy and Mother of Machines, is probably the best villain Magic has ever had, or at least the best the game has had in the 21st century. If Yawgmoth is a Satan of the setting, Elesh Norn is his Antichrist, the embodiment of all his power and evil condensed into a physical form that genuinely, earnestly believes that the world is a better place when all will be one under Phyrexia. She managed to unify the Phyrexians not just through power, but through a grand vision of Phyrexia's future that none of the other Praetors could convince the others of alone. Jingatexius and Vorinclex ceded to her willingly, while Shieldred and Ouroboros required some convincing. But before long, she crowned herself Mother of Machines, and set about the task of bringing Phyrexia's glory to every living being, in every world. Like Yawgmoth was back in the day, Elesh Norn is the mascot and figurehead of Phyrexia for modern magic, and her presence is unmistakable. Her distinctive headpiece is as much a symbol of Phyrexia as Yawgmoth's crying mask, or even the Phi symbol itself. And she was at the centre of the marketing strategy for Magic's two most recent standard sets, Phyrexia All Will Be One and March of the Machine, which detailed Phyrexia's attempted conquest of the multiverse under her command. But most importantly, unlike Yawgmoth, Elesh Norn has a level of physicality to her. Yawgmoth was considered too powerful and ephemeral as a concept to ever put on a magic card, which is why the only one he ever got was him as a human before he ever arrived on Phyrexia. But Elesh Norn has a physical presence reflected by her 3 dedicated cards. We know how she looks and moves, how she speaks and interacts with others. We know how big she is and what she can do, and these are the kind of things we're looking for in a Dead by Daylight killer. Elesh Norn perfectly stands in the middle ground between an overwhelming threat and a manageable one. She gets in physical altercations from time to time, and has shown the ability to go toe-to-toe with powerful planeswalkers, but her presence is more often than not enough to kowtow any resistance. Her design is iconic, unforgettable, and informs Phyrexia's new aesthetic that has a lot in common with Clive Barker's Cenobites that she shares a name with. Dead by Daylight knows body horror, and Elesh Norn balances grotesque sights of flayed skin and exposed bones and musculature with a level of grace and elegance that we don't see very often among our ranks of killers. And there's tons of ways to express her detached, imperious demeanour through her animations and power. Pinhead and Sadako have shown us how a character can do the actions needed for a killer without having to touch the survivor themselves, and Elesh Norn basically never exerting herself physically in the vein of Pinhead would suit her character perfectly. If you're interested in learning more about Phyrexia as a setting, down to things like the art style of the cards, the imagery used in them, and even the Phyrexian language, check out the Ristic Studies video Phyrexia is Hell, also linked in the description. Sam is a phenomenal creator and he covers Phyrexia in far more detail than I ever could, so do go give him a watch. But before I go on to show you my idea for a power for Elesh Norn, there is the important question. But what about the license holder? Would they be amenable to crossovers? And the answer I have for that question is, have you seen Wizards of the Coast lately? They cannot get enough of crossovers in Magic. The past couple of years, Magic has been exploring a new product line called Universes Beyond, where IPs outside of Magic's own have been included in specialist products and brought to cardboard. Whether these are as custom designed cards specifically for these featured characters or IPs, or sometimes skins for existing cards, themed around third-party licenses. Specialised cards have been published for franchises such as The Walking Dead, Street Fighter, Warhammer 40k and Stranger Things, with an entire Lord of the Rings themed set coming very very soon, and a Doctor Who crossover arriving in October. Magic knows the value of big licensing deals as well as behaviour does, and have more than enough clout as Hasbro's current biggest cash cow to come to an agreement with behaviour. It wouldn't be the first time they've worked with an online game to bring their characters along for the ride. Smite saw a chromatic pack with several planeswalkers, plus the Phyrexia Atraxa added as part of an event earlier in the year. It certainly isn't a stretch to imagine a crossover with Dead by Daylight as well. Hell, DBD itself is a bankable enough franchise these days to have its own outsourced spin-off games. It really wouldn't be out of the question to have a crossover that goes both ways, with Dead by Daylight characters featuring in a secret lair release for Magic, in a similar vein to the Walking Dead or Fortnite releases, while Magic comes to DBD with a chapter at the same time. Don't get me wrong, this is far from likely, and there is a very strong chance the two just aren't on each other's radar, but DBD is about to have Nick Cage enter the game, and Magic is working with Hot Pockets. Both companies have had weirder business partners than each other, and given they just bumped off Elesh Norn in the main Magic story, in a fucking awful send-off I might add, it'd be a great way to immortalise her and the history of Phyrexia in our little game. So Elesh Norn is our killer candidate from New Phyrexia, bringing her horrific majesty and the glory of the machine into the fog. But what would her power be? I decided to weaponize one of Elesh Norn's most infamous traits for this power, her love of ossification, that being the transformation of living material into bone. Elesh Norn has a habit of turning both her enemies and devoted followers into architecture, made of bone, porcelain, or living metal, and has been shown to be able to manipulate these substances herself to aid her in the thick of battle. The icons for the power and perks featured in this video were made by the legendary Wheatstraws, who made all the perk icons that I play with that you might see in my videos from time to time, and is as much of a magic nerd as I am. He's an absolute hero, and you should all go check his work out on dozens of perk icons and more on Nightlight. He's a true keystone of this community, and his work is direly underrated. So, let's look at the power. Elesh Norn, or the Praetor, is a tall killer who moves at 110% speed. Yeah, my first 110, with a 24 meter terror radius. But she has a 40 meter lullaby to go with her power, all will be one. Elesh Norn has 2 charges for her power, that regenerates at a rate of 1 charge every 10 seconds. Hold M2 to send out a marker up 20 meters away like Pinhead's chain, slowing the Praetor to 4.0 meters per second while it's being aimed. Once the marker is placed, a pillar of adulation will rupture the ground where it is placed. The Pillar of Adulation has the same height as Norn herself, and is only marginally narrower than a dropped pallet. From there, a direction can be chosen and the pillar will travel at 130% speed for 10 meters in that direction. The pillar will spawn instantly as a marker is placed and has full collision, both for the survivors and the killer, but can't be deployed within 8 meters of a hook. If a survivor is pushed by a pillar, whether it's moving or by shoving itself out the ground, any animations during the process of will be interrupted. If a Pillar of Adulation's movement path would collide with a wall for the first time, its movement path will bounce off the wall and keep going for up to 10 additional meters, or until the pillar hits another obstacle, whichever comes first. A pillar that reaches the end of its path or hits a subsequent wall beyond the first will shatter. A Pillar of Adulation grabs any survivor it hits with its ossified porcelain hands, holding them to the face of the pillar that grabbed them, front, back, left or right, and carrying them until the pillar reaches the end of its path and shatters. If that face collides with a wall, the pillar will freeze in place for 3 seconds. Elesh Norn may use the active ability button at this time to shatter the pillar and deal a single health state to all survivors who are held against the wall this way. Elesh Norn cannot attack for 1.5 seconds after this is used. If 2 Pillars of Adulation collide with each other, all grasped survivors on both pillars will instantly be dealt a health state, and both pillars will immediately shatter. A Pillar of Adulation summoned underneath a pallet that's already dropped will break it immediately. A Pillar of Adulation that has its movement path interrupted by a dropped pallet will treat the pallet as a wall and ricochet or shatter accordingly, breaking the pallet in the process. I have some add-ons here too, and if you're a Magic fan you might recognise some of those names. And since I don't make perks very often, I thought I'd do some this time around. Tell me what you think of them. Birth of Phyrexia. When a trial begins, Birth of Phyrexia becomes active for 60 seconds. When a generator is completed, it becomes active for 30 seconds. Basic attacks inflicted while Birth of Phyrexia is active afflict the survivor with broken for 45 seconds. Machine Orthodoxy. Whenever you kick a generator, Machine Orthodoxy activates. The next window that you vote off triggering Machine Orthodoxy will be vaulted 30% faster, and the auras of all survivors within 60 meters of the vault will be revealed for 6 seconds. Hex Spread the Sickness. Whenever a survivor unhooks another survivor, they are cursed by Hex Spread the Sickness, and the curse is removed from all other survivors. Survivors spread the curse to other survivors by being within 3 meters of them for 10 seconds or longer. Survivors cursed by Hex Spread the Sickness suffer from the blindness and exhaustion status effects until the curse is removed. Hex Spread the Sickness is only lit when 1 or more survivors are actively cursed by the Hex. I think Elesh Norn will be better off suited to being a paragraph or killer only chapter. The Phyrexians are a threatening presence regardless of context, so you don't really need an explanation behind their appearance in the fog to suspend your disbelief appropriately, but most of the survivor options could bring from Magic's protagonist list are like actual wizards or fantastical creatures, and they might be pushing our luck a little bit. A far more realistic option would be cosplay style cosmetics for other survivors like the Attack on Titan ones. Dwight dressed as Jace Beleren, for example, David as Gideon, or Nia as Chandra, as a neat way to acknowledge the setting without having to do the narrative and thematic legwork of having this guy stabbed to death by this guy. Magic is a setting that I care about a great deal, and despite having some genuinely excellent villains, it consistently fails them when it comes time to tell their stories. mostly in terms of their defeats, since both the War of the Spark and March of the Machine arcs ended pretty anticlimactically despite some good build-up. Part of this, I think, is to do with Magic's desire to keep its setting in some level of positive stasis, where the good guys are generally winning so they can keep the business model intact, making them filthy amounts of cash, and also to maintain the brand's family-friendly image, which is hard to do when the Phyrexians are literally flaying people alive to brainwash them into the regime. March of the Machine saw Elesh, Norn and the new Phyrexians defeated, ending a story that has been kickstarted in 2011 in Scars of Mirrodin, in a way that didn't really do its villains any favours. They made no meaningful gains, their leadership was completely destroyed, and the tactics they employed that got them beat so badly were really stupid, which deflated their value as a threat. This especially rankled when Scars of Mirrodin, the original creation of New Phyrexia, highlighted just how bad a plane getting even slightly infected by the oil could become, but if Elesh Norn invades 30 planes at once, then I guess that's still mostly fine for them. Such a disappointing story to an unbelievably hype arc, and unfortunately, that's just par the course of Magic's story. Letting Elesh Norn loose in the fog would be a great way to let an enduring and ever-charming villain live long beyond the end of her story as a killer in the entity's realm, spreading the good word of Phyrexia to the survivors and introducing a whole new kind of body horror that we don't really get to see all too much in this game anymore. It's the kind of licensing deal that on one hand I certainly don't expect to ever see, but on the other hand, if it did happen, I wouldn't be surprised to see it. Wizards of the Coast are absolutely horny for crossovers right now, and Dead by Daylight is trying very hard to expand its brand too, so anything could happen. So that's everything I have to say about this particular topic. Do you think I was insane for choosing it? Was it worth your time? Are you excited for the chapter coming next week? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments because I do read all of them. While you're down there, do feel free to subscribe if you want to see more in the Protection Problem series, more DBD lore videos and all sorts of fun stuff I've got planned for the next couple of weeks. If you really like me, you can check me out on Patreon. Given that I'm in the process of moving apartments, the patrons are unironically absolute diamonds saving my ass right now. Patrons get access to my videos a day early, they get access to a Discord chat and more exciting cool stuff, so do feel drop on by for and drop the channel some support. On that note, I'll see you next week for the video on the new Survivor. Ta-ta for now.